She loved him, until the empire was hers. Part 1: The Sanctuary Trap. What is the only way to destroy a monster who has absolutely no weaknesses? You don't fight him. You don't threaten him. You make him fall in love. Today, we decode the dark psychology of the sanctuary trap, and how peace can be the ultimate weapon. Julian Cross was the undisputed king of Manhattan commercial real estate. He was a ruthless, hyper-paranoid billionaire who built his empire by crushing rivals and anticipating every betrayal. He trusted absolutely no one. He ran background checks on his own family members and slept with one eye open. His corporate fortress was impenetrable. He had no emotional blind spots because he had no emotions, until he met Eleanor. Eleanor Hayes wasn't a fierce corporate shark or a desperate socialite. She was an elegant, soft-spoken woman who owned a quiet, high-end art restoration gallery in Soho. They met at a chaotic charity gala, while every other guest aggressively pitched Julian business deals and begged for his attention. Eleanor simply stood by a painting, sipping sparkling water. When Julian approached her, she didn't ask about his net worth. She spoke softly about the history of oil canvas. She didn't want anything from him. Over the next few months, Eleanor became his quiet escape. She offered him chamomile tea instead of scotch. She listened to his stress without ever offering business advice. For the first time in his brutal life, Julian found a safe haven. Julian truly believed he had found the one pure thing in a corrupt world. He thought he had found a woman who loved him, not his empire. But here is the terrifying reality. Eleanor didn't care about oil paintings. And she certainly didn't care about his stress. Eleanor's entire identity, the soft voice, the calming demeanor, the complete disinterest in his wealth, was a meticulously manufactured illusion. She had spent 2 grueling years studying Julian's psychological profile, his past traumas, and his daily habits. She didn't just stumble into his life. She mathematically engineered herself to be the exact missing puzzle piece his exhausted mind was desperately craving. How do you disarm a hyper-paranoid predator? In dark psychology, this is known as the sanctuary trap through tactical empathy. Ruthless tycoons like Julian live in a constant state of fight or flight. Their brains are flooded with cortisol, constantly expecting an attack. By presenting herself as a completely non-threatening, calming presence, Eleanor entirely bypassed Julian's threat detection system, the amygdala. Predators are prepared for swords, poison, and blackmail. They have zero defense mechanisms against genuine peace. By providing emotional rest, Eleanor became an addictive drug to a man who had been at war his entire life. The first law of power in the game of seduction. The most lethal Trojan horse doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like home. Beware of the person who seems perfectly tailored to fill your deepest emotional voids. True predators do not always attack your walls. Sometimes, they just offer you a soft place to rest until you willingly give them the keys to the gate. Part 2: The Invisible Wall. How do you strip a paranoid king of his most loyal guards without drawing a single drop of blood? You don't fight them. You convince the king that his guards are the ones secretly holding him hostage. Today, we decode the dark art of subtle isolation. Julian Cross had survived decades of corporate warfare because of one man, Robert Thorne. His ruthless CFO and oldest confidant, Robert was the only person on earth allowed to challenge Julian's decisions. When Eleanor entered Julian's life, Robert's predatory instincts instantly flared. He ran a quiet investigation and found her background was almost too perfect. Devoid of any normal human flaws, Robert warned Julian, suggesting Eleanor might be a highly sophisticated corporate plant. Julian, naturally paranoid, confronted Eleanor. If she had gotten angry, defensive, or demanded Robert be fired, Julian's defenses would have locked her out forever. Instead, Eleanor simply looked down, her eyes welling with soft tears, and smiled sadly. "Robert is a brilliant man," she whispered gently. "He is just trying to protect your empire." But Julian, It must be so exhausting for you to be the undisputed king, yet still have your employees treat you like a child who cannot make his own choices. Does he really think you are too weak to judge who to trust? Eleanor didn't defend her innocence. She weaponized Julian's massive ego. She didn't ask Julian to choose between her and Robert. Instead, she masterfully reframed Robert's decades of fiercely protective loyalty as condescending insubordination. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor planted tiny, invisible seeds. Every time Robert questioned a business deal, Julian no longer heard a loyal advisor trying to protect the company, thanks to Eleanor's whisper. He heard a subordinate trying to control him. Julian's pride could not tolerate the illusion of weakness. By the end of the quarter, Julian brutally fired the only man capable of saving him. How does a soft-spoken woman destroy a 20-year brotherhood in a month? In dark psychology, this is known as subtle isolation via ego reframing. A master manipulator knows they cannot win a direct war against a trusted veteran. If Eleanor attacked Robert, Julian would have defended him. Instead, Eleanor agreed with Robert's actions but assigned a highly toxic motive to them. By linking Robert's protective nature to a direct insult against Julian's dominance and independence, Eleanor turned Julian's greatest shield into a perceived threat. She didn't isolate Julian. She manipulated Julian into isolating himself. The second law of power in the game of seduction. Isolation is the absolute prerequisite to total control. Beware of the gentle voice that strokes your ego by making you doubt your oldest allies. When someone slowly cuts all your lifelines while telling you that you are strong enough to swim on your own, they are simply waiting for you to drown. Part 3: The Broken Wing. What is the absolute fastest way to break into an impenetrable vault? You don't bring a bomb. You bring a broken wing. Today, we decode the lethal power of manufactured vulnerability, and how a fake tear can unlock a billionaire's darkest secrets. With Robert Thorne gone, Julian Cross was entirely isolated at the top of his empire. He had no one to trust except Eleanor. At this point, Julian was facing a massive, highly classified federal tax audit. His entire net worth depended on a hidden network of offshore shell companies, his black ledger, known only to him. Eleanor never asked about his money. Instead, she orchestrated a crisis of her own. One rainy evening, Julian received a panicked, trembling phone call. Eleanor's quiet, pristine art gallery in Soho had been vandalized. When Julian arrived, the police were gone, and Eleanor was sitting on the floor surrounded by shattered glass, clutching her knees and weeping softly. Julian, the cold-blooded shark, felt an overwhelming, primal surge of protective rage. He held her as she cried, "I have nothing to hide. Yet they destroyed my sanctuary," she whispered, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "How do you do it, Julian? How do you carry the crushing weight of your secrets all alone? It must be so heavy." Julian looked at this fragile, completely transparent woman. For the first time in his life, his absolute paranoia broke. He felt a desperate psychological need to prove that he wasn't alone. To share his crushing burden with the only pure thing he possessed. To comfort her. To prove his ultimate, unconditional trust. Julian took her to his penthouse. He opened his encrypted laptop and showed her the black ledger. He explained the offshore routing numbers and the hidden shell companies, believing he was sharing his soul. Eleanor listened with wide, innocent eyes, gently stroking his hand. But behind those tear-filled eyes, Eleanor's photographic memory was silently capturing every single master password, account number, and offshore routing protocol. Why does a hyper-vigilant billionaire voluntarily hand over the keys to his destruction? In dark psychology, this is known as manufactured vulnerability triggering the savior complex. Paranoid individuals constantly expect others to attack or steal from them. By presenting herself as a shattered victim in need of saving, Eleanor completely inverted the power dynamic. Julian's brain released massive amounts of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, driven by his instinct to protect her. When Eleanor shared her fake helplessness, Julian felt psychologically compelled to reciprocate by sharing his own vulnerability, his darkest secrets. She didn't break into his vault. She simply cried until he felt guilty for keeping it locked. The third law of power in the game of seduction. Fake fragility is the ultimate skeleton key. When a predator wants you to take off your heavy armor, they don't attack you, they show you their own bleeding wound, patiently waiting for you to drop your shield so you can heal them. Part 4: The Blinding White Veil. What is the perfect crime? It isn't hiding your theft in the dark. It is executing it in broad daylight, right in front of your victim, while they are too distracted looking at something beautiful. Today, we decode the dark art of the ultimate psychological smokescreen. With the master keys to Julian's offshore, black ledger, securely memorized, Eleanor needed time to meticulously drain the empire without triggering his remaining security protocols. To buy that time, she needed a distraction so massive, so emotionally consuming, that the paranoid billionaire would look completely the other way. 6 months after the gallery incident, Julian proposed. He offered her a stunning $5 million diamond ring overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Eleanor wept tears of overwhelming joy and whispered, "Yes." Immediately, she transformed into the deeply devoted, slightly overwhelmed bride-to-be. She insisted on personally planning a lavish, high-society wedding in the Hamptons. She constantly involved Julian in the exhausting minutiae, tasting French champagne vintages, arguing over seating charts for rival CEOs, and reviewing floral arrangements. Julian, intoxicated by the fantasy of a normal, happy life, let his guard down completely. He was too busy being a groom to be a ruthless corporate titan. While Julian was arguing with elite caterers about the menu, Eleanor was sitting in her quiet art gallery, systematically dismantling his offshore empire. She didn't transfer the billions all at once, which would have triggered federal banking alarms. Instead, using the master passwords she stole during her moment of vulnerability, she established a highly complex, automated algorithmic bleed. She began rerouting millions of dollars a day from Julian's hidden shell companies into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets based in jurisdictions with no extradition treaties. The brilliant twist? She used the chaotic, multi-million-dollar expenses of the Hamptons wedding as the perfect financial camouflage to launder the initial test transfers. The wedding wasn't a celebration of their love, it was a heavily funded, tactical distraction operation. How does a ruthless billionaire fail to notice his empire being drained? In dark psychology, this is known as cognitive overload through emotional misdirection. Paranoia requires a massive amount of mental energy and focus. By flooding Julian's brain with the intense dopamine of romantic love, combined with the logistical stress of planning a high-profile wedding, Eleanor intentionally consumed 100% of his cognitive bandwidth. Magicians use bright flashes of light to hide their hands. Eleanor used a blinding white wedding dress to hide a multi-billion-dollar heist. When the brain is hyper-focused on a highly emotional, complex task, it literally becomes blind to everything else in the periphery. The fourth law of power in the game of seduction. The most dangerous illusion is the one that uses your own happiness as the blindfold. A predator rarely attacks when you are sad and guarded. They strike when you are euphoric, surrounded by flowers and champagne, entirely convinced that the war is finally over. Part 5: The Phantom Threat. What do you do when a paranoid king finally spots a shadow in the dark? You don't try to hide. You convince him that the shadow is actually a shield. Today, we decode the dark art of high-stakes gaslighting and the invention of phantom enemies. Eleanor's automated algorithmic bleed was nearly flawless. But no system is perfect. A minor glitch occurred. An obscure Swiss banker noticed a routing anomaly and sent a highly encrypted warning directly to Julian's private server. Julian's legendary paranoia, dormant for months, instantly reignited. He stormed into their luxury penthouse, slamming the printed anomaly onto the marble counter. Cornering Eleanor, his eyes were wild, his trust fracturing. He demanded to know why his ultra-secure offshore accounts were moving millions of dollars without his direct authorization. The trap was on the verge of collapsing. Eleanor didn't flinch, she didn't act confused, and she absolutely did not deny it. Instead, she looked at him with fierce, tearful determination. She confessed immediately, but she claimed she had intercepted a terrifying rumor from a high-level federal prosecutor, a wealthy client who frequented her Soho gallery. The Department of Justice was secretly preparing to freeze Julian's offshore assets by midnight. Eleanor told Julian she panicked, knowing he was unreachable in a board meeting. She used the master access he had given her to urgently reroute the funds into an untraceable, safe wallet, to protect him from federal ruin. She didn't steal his money, she risked everything to save him. To sell the lie, she handed him a burner phone with the new, but entirely Eleanor-controlled, cryptocurrency wallet access, proving the money was safe. How do you survive getting caught red-handed by a billionaire? In dark psychology, this is known as preemptive framing and reactive gaslighting. Instead of defending her actions, Eleanor invented a massive, terrifying external threat. By framing her theft as a desperate act of fierce loyalty, she hijacked Julian's paranoia. Julian's brain was already naturally terrified of the federal government. He easily accepted Eleanor's lie because it perfectly confirmed his pre-existing fears of the DOJ. Rather than forcing him to face the unbearable, ego-shattering truth that his perfect bride was actually a corporate predator. The fifth law of power in the game of seduction. The greatest lies are wrapped in the illusion of protection. If someone gets caught with their hand inside your vault and passionately claims they were only checking the locks to keep you safe, do not thank them. Change the codes immediately. Part 6: The Paper Shield. What is the ultimate proof of love for a paranoid billionaire? It isn't a diamond ring. It's a legally binding signature. Today, we decode the fatal mistake of weaponizing trust, and the exact moment the prey willingly hands the predator a loaded gun. Eleanor's brilliant lie about the federal prosecutor didn't just save her from being caught. It elevated her to the status of a god in Julian's eyes. In his twisted, hyper-vigilant mind, Eleanor risking federal prison to save his offshore accounts proved her absolute, unquestionable loyalty. With their lavish Hamptons wedding only weeks away, Julian's corporate lawyers warned him that the Department of Justice was indeed circling his domestic real estate empire. Julian needed a proxy. He needed someone entirely clean, with absolutely no corporate ties, to legally hold his massive Manhattan assets until the federal heat died down. There was only one person on earth he trusted with his life. Julian brought Eleanor into his secure boardroom. He didn't present her with a strict prenuptial agreement to protect his wealth. Instead, he slid a thick legal folder across the table. It was a durable power of attorney and a blanket corporate proxy. Julian legally transferred his voting rights, corporate control, and emergency liquidation authority over his entire Manhattan real estate portfolio directly to Eleanor. Julian smiled, genuinely believing he was a tactical genius. He thought he was using his innocent, art-loving bride as an untouchable legal shield against the government. He didn't realize that the offshore crypto bleed was just Eleanor's appetizer. Hacking digital accounts was difficult and slow, but Julian had just handed her the ultimate shortcut. With that single signature, Eleanor didn't need to steal his money in the dark anymore. She now possessed the absolute legal right to sell his physical skyscrapers in broad daylight. How do you convince a ruthless tycoon to sign away his physical empire? In dark psychology, this is known as the proxy paradox and reverse psychology through submission. Julian believed he was in total control because he initiated the transfer. Eleanor had spent a year acting completely overwhelmed by his wealth and claiming she didn't understand complex finance. This manufactured incompetence made Julian feel like giving her the power was his brilliant, strategic idea, when a manipulator makes the victim believe that the trap was their own invention. The victim will defend the trap to the death. The sixth law of power in the game of seduction. The ultimate betrayal is always legally binding. Love is a fluid emotion, but a signature is an absolute weapon. Never hand over the legal keys to your kingdom to prove your affection. The law does not care if your heart was broken when your empire is legally sold to the highest bidder. Part 7: The Countdown to Zero. While a paranoid king plans a lavish feast, the assassin silently sharpens her blade. What happens when the countdown to "I do" is actually a countdown to absolute, irreversible ruin? Today, we decode the dark art of the silent liquidation. The Hamptons' wedding was exactly 14 days away. The New York Society pages were obsessed with the upcoming wedding of the decade. Julian Cross was entirely consumed by the intoxicating fantasy of his new life. He was busy finalizing the guest list of billionaires, attending tuxedo fittings, and preparing his vows. Eleanor played the role of the stressed, detail-obsessed bride to perfection, keeping Julian distracted with endless questions about floral arrangements and champagne vintages. But the moment Julian left their penthouse for his daily wedding rehearsals, the bride vanished, and the corporate predator emerged, armed with the blanket durable power of attorney. Eleanor secretly contacted an aggressive, notoriously quiet private equity firm based in Dubai. She offered them Julian's crown jewels, 3 of his most iconic Manhattan skyscrapers. The catch? She offered them at a shocking 30% discount below market value in exchange for a strictly confidential, all-cash, expedited closing. Commercial real estate deals of this magnitude usually take months of public auditing. So how did Eleanor sell 3 massive skyscrapers in a week without Julian finding out? She didn't sell the physical buildings. Using the legal proxy Julian handed her, Eleanor quietly sold the holding companies that owned the buildings. By transferring the corporate entities rather than the physical deeds, the sale entirely bypassed the New York Public Real Estate Registry. The billions of dollars in cash were instantly routed into her untraceable offshore crypto network. Julian was still arguing with caterers about the caviar menu, completely unaware that he technically no longer owned the roof over his head. How does a hyper-vigilant tycoon fail to notice his physical empire vanishing? In dark psychology, this is known as the illusion of future permanence combined with temporal anchoring. Eleanor anchored Julian's entire psychological focus to a future event, the wedding. When a victim is heavily invested in a guaranteed, long-term fantasy, like marriage, their brain assumes the present is stable. Julian stopped checking his bag because his eyes were entirely fixated on the horizon. Eleanor used the promise of forever to make him completely blind to the fact that his present reality was being mathematically erased. The seventh law of power in the game of seduction. A promise of eternity is the perfect camouflage for a temporary heist. Never let the intoxicating fantasy of a perfect future make you abandon your defenses in the present. If someone keeps pointing your eyes toward tomorrow, they are probably robbing you today. Part 8: The Perfect Void. What is louder than a gunshot? The absolute, deafening silence of an empty room. Today, we decode the psychology of the perfect vanishing act, and the terrifying moment a billionaire realizes his future has been mathematically deleted. The day finally arrived. A lavish Hamptons estate, hundreds of A-list guests, and millions of dollars in white roses. Julian Cross stood at the altar in his bespoke tuxedo, feeling a rare, genuine emotion, pure happiness. He had finally let his guard down. The orchestra began playing the bridal chorus. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the estate opened, but no one walked through. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The whispers of the elite crowd grew loud. Julian's chest tightened, not with anger, but with panic. He thought she was having a panic attack, or a medical emergency. He abandoned the altar, ignoring the paparazzi, and rushed up to the master bridal suite. He threw the heavy doors open, expecting to find Eleanor crying on the floor, ready to comfort her just as he had done so many times before. The room was immaculate. The $5 million diamond engagement ring sat perfectly placed on the glass vanity. Next to it hung her custom silk wedding dress, completely unworn. But Eleanor was gone. Julian grabbed his phone and called her. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." He called her quiet Soho art gallery. Disconnected. He frantically ordered his security team to track her chauffeured car. It was found abandoned at a private airstrip 3 hours ago. Eleanor didn't get cold feet. She had engineered her disappearance with absolute military precision. By the time Julian was standing at the altar waiting for her to walk down the aisle, she was already thousands of miles away, leaving absolutely zero digital or physical footprint. How does a sudden disappearance completely break a strong mind? In dark psychology, this is known as ambiguous loss and cognitive paralysis. When an enemy attacks you, your brain triggers a fight or flight response. You mobilize your defenses. But when someone simply vanishes without a trace, leaving no closure, no note, and no explanation, the brain violently crashes. Julian didn't immediately call his lawyers or check his bank accounts because his mind was stuck trying to solve the emotional mystery of a missing bride. Eleanor weaponized his love to induce severe cognitive dissonance, using his emotional paralysis to buy the crucial hours she needed to escape the country. The eighth law of power in the game of seduction. The cruelest cut leaves no scar, it leaves a void. An enemy who fights you gives you a target to destroy. An enemy who vanishes entirely turns your own mind into a prison, leaving you to fight a ghost you can never catch. Part 9: The Hollow Empire. What happens when the king finally opens his impenetrable vault, only to find nothing but dust? The deadliest venom doesn't burn when it enters your veins. It numbs you until your heart simply stops. Today, we decode the terrifying moment a billionaire realizes his empire was deleted. For 12 agonizing hours, Julian Cross was a broken groom. He paced around his luxury penthouse in his tuxedo, desperately trying to solve the emotional mystery of his missing bride. But as the sun set over Manhattan, the romantic fog in his brain finally began to clear, and his dormant, primal instincts as a ruthless corporate predator violently snapped back online. Something was deeply wrong. If Eleanor had simply gotten cold feet, she would have left a note. She wouldn't have abandoned a $5 million ring. Julian's blood ran cold. He ran to his secure office, locked the door, and opened his encrypted laptop to check his offshore, black ledger. He typed in his master password. Access denied. He tried his secondary biometric override. Invalid credentials. Sweating profusely, Julian called his highly discreet Swiss banker on a secure line. The banker sounded confused and terrified. "Mr. Cross, your fiancé authorized the complete liquidation of those accounts weeks ago. The funds were fully routed to an untraceable server in the Caymans." Julian's chest seized. He immediately called his elite corporate lawyers in New York to initiate an emergency freeze on his massive domestic real estate portfolio. The lead lawyer was dead silent for a moment before speaking. "Julian, what are you talking about? You gave Eleanor the durable power of attorney. She legally sold the holding companies to a Dubai private equity firm last week. The new owners took physical possession of your skyscrapers this morning." The devastating reality crushed Julian like an anvil. Eleanor didn't just run away from the wedding. The wedding was a meticulously timed detonation sequence. She scheduled the ceremony for the exact date that the final international wire transfers cleared the global banking system. The flowers, the catering, the tuxedo. It was all an elaborate stage play designed to keep Julian occupied while she mathematically erased him. Julian wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was sitting in a penthouse he no longer legally owned, wearing a tuxedo, completely bankrupt. How does a hyper-vigilant mind process absolute ruin? In dark psychology, this is known as delayed reality integration and the hollow-out strategy. The human brain protects itself from sudden, catastrophic trauma by delaying the processing of devastating information. Julian's initial obsession with finding his runaway bride, was a psychological defense mechanism. It was easier to process a broken heart than a stolen empire. Eleanor utilized the hollow-out strategy, like a parasite that eats an insect from the inside out while leaving the exoskeleton perfectly intact. Eleanor kept the physical facade of Julian's wealthy life completely undisturbed until the very last second. By the time Julian noticed the rot, there was nothing left to save. The ninth law of power in the game of seduction. If you hand someone the power to destroy you, assuming they won't because they love you, you have already committed financial suicide. Trust is an emotion, but the law is absolute. A predator will always use your blind faith as the exact legal mechanism to strip you of everything you own. Part 10: The Ghost in the Machine. What is a fate worse than losing your entire empire, screaming the absolute truth to the world, and having everyone look at you like you belong in an asylum? Today, we decode the psychology of institutional gaslighting, and how a perfect predator erases their own existence. Julian Cross was an apex predator. He wasn't going to surrender his kingdom without a bloodbath. He immediately assembled a war room of $1 an hour litigators, private investigators, and forensic accountants. He marched into the FBI's white-collar crime division in Manhattan, demanding federal warrants. He reported a massive, multi-billion-dollar wire fraud and corporate theft scheme, screaming for the immediate arrest of Eleanor Hayes. He gave them the address of her upscale Soho art gallery. He gave them her phone numbers, her bank details, and her social security number. He laid out the entire narrative, how she manipulated him, staged a break-in, stole his master passwords, and fraudulently liquidated his real estate to Dubai. Julian sat back, expecting the full weight of the United States government to hunt her down. But when the lead federal agent returned to the interrogation room a week later, he didn't have a warrant. He had a file of cold, hard legal facts. The agent placed the file on the table. Mr. Cross, Eleanor Hayes does not exist. The social security number belonged to a deceased woman in Oregon. The Soho Art Gallery was leased under an untraceable shell corporation, paid entirely in cash, and had been completely emptied overnight. There were no fingerprints, but the most devastating blow wasn't the fake identity, it was the paperwork. The FBI analyzed the transfer of the Manhattan skyscrapers. There was no coercion, no forgery, and no hack. Julian had willingly signed a durable power of attorney, notarized by his own lawyers. Legally, no crime had been committed. Julian hadn't been robbed. In the eyes of the law, he simply made a catastrophically stupid business decision to gift his empire to a proxy who then legally sold it. Julian screamed, insisting he was emotionally manipulated, but without a shred of physical evidence. His frantic, sweating, wild-eyed ranting didn't sound like a billionaire who had been victimized. He sounded like a bitter, unstable ex-fiancé having a psychotic breakdown over a bad prenuptial mistake. How do you destroy a man's credibility using his own truth? In dark psychology, this is known as institutional gaslighting and manufactured hysteria. Eleanor knew Julian would eventually go to the authorities. Her masterstroke was ensuring that all the physical evidence pointed to Julian's own voluntary actions, the signature, while all evidence of her malicious intent was entirely erased. When a victim is stripped of undeniable proof, their desperate attempts to convince authorities often manifest as frantic, hysterical behavior. The authorities judge the victim's current emotional instability, contrasting it with the cold, perfectly legal paperwork. Eleanor didn't just steal his money. She mathematically engineered a scenario where seeking justice would legally brand him as insane. The 10th law of power in the game of seduction. The perfect crime isn't just about escaping with the gold. It is about leaving the victim looking like a madman when they report it. The law does not protect broken hearts, and it does not punish emotional manipulation. The law only protects the ink on the paper. Part 11: The Charity of Monsters. When a master predator steals your crown, they don't always kill you. Sometimes, They keep you alive specifically so you can witness their reign. What happens when the person who ruined your life buys your next meal? Today, we decode the psychology of the final, ironic gift. Julian Cross was officially a ghost. With his holding companies sold and his offshore accounts drained, his remaining domestic shell corporations collapsed under massive debt. Creditors seized his penthouse, his cars, and his bank accounts. The former king of Manhattan real estate was now wandering the rainy, unforgiving streets of the city he used to own. Every massive skyscraper he looked up at now belonged to an untraceable Dubai firm, to her. He eventually found himself sitting on the edge of a bed in a grimy, cheap motel room in Queens, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. He was completely broken, surviving on cheap diner coffee and the loose cash he had in his pockets the day of the wedding. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. A private courier, wearing a sharp suit that Julian used to wear, handed him a small, pristine black velvet box. Julian slowly opened the box. Inside was the exact $5 million diamond engagement ring he had placed on Eleanor's finger. Pinned to the velvet cushion was a handwritten note on expensive, heavy cardstock. It read, "A king shouldn't starve in his own city. Sell this, and buy yourself a sanctuary." Eleanor didn't return the ring out of guilt. She returned it because $5 million was now absolute pocket change to her. By handing him back his most expensive declaration of love as a charity handout, she mathematically quantified his ultimate defeat. She was forcing him to fund his pathetic, day-to-day survival using the exact weapon she had used to blind him. Why does a predator return a valuable asset to their victim? In dark psychology, this is known as the devaluation discard and dominance anchoring. Returning an item of immense financial and emotional value signifies absolute devaluation. It told Julian that his most prized possession, and his love, meant absolutely nothing to her. Furthermore, Eleanor anchored her dominance into his basic human survival. Julian had no money. He had to sell the ring to eat and pay rent. Every time he bought a meal or paid for his cheap motel room using that money, he would be psychologically forced to remember that he was living off the scraps thrown by the woman who conquered him. The 11th law of power in the game of seduction. The cruelest strike is not the blade, but the bandage applied by the assassin. When the enemy who took your empire offers you a copper coin for your survival, do not take it. It is not a gift of mercy. It is a receipt for your soul, designed to humiliate you every time you take a breath. Part 12: The Eternal Loop. What does a monster do after consuming an entire kingdom? They do not retire. They do not feel remorse. They simply wash their hands, change their name, and find a new crown to steal. Today, we witness the terrifying birth of an eternal predatory cycle. A year had passed since Julian Cross was mathematically erased from the New York elite. 3,000 miles away, in the heart of Los Angeles, a chaotic, high-society charity gala was taking place. The room was filled with Silicon Valley titans and Hollywood moguls. Among them was David Mercer, a ruthless, hyper-paranoid tech billionaire who had just survived a brutal corporate war. David was exhausted. He was surrounded by aggressive socialites and venture capitalists aggressively pitching him business deals. Suffocating from the noise, David walked away from the crowd, seeking a moment of peace. In the quietest corner of the grand hall, standing next to a classic marble sculpture, he noticed an elegant, soft-spoken woman. She wasn't wearing flashy diamonds or trying to network. She was simply standing alone, looking peaceful, sipping a glass of sparkling water. Drawn to her calming presence, David approached her. David introduced himself, expecting her to immediately recognize his name and ask for an investment. Instead, she smiled a soft, unassuming smile. "I'm Claire," she whispered gently. When David asked what she did for a living, she didn't mention tech or finance. "I own a quiet, rare book restoration shop in Pasadena," she replied softly. She didn't ask about his net worth. She didn't offer any business advice. She simply looked at his tired eyes and spoke calmly about the history of the marble sculpture. David, a ruthless predator who trusted absolutely no one, suddenly felt his defenses melting. He felt like he had finally found a sanctuary. Claire looked at him with innocent, wide eyes, executing the exact same script, the exact same pauses, and the exact same manufactured vulnerability she had used on Julian. The trap was reset. Why do apex predators never change their tactics? In dark psychology, this is known as repetitive predatory grooming and the dark triad loop. Psychopaths and extreme manipulators view human beings as algorithms. Once they successfully crack a specific psychological profile, in this case, the isolated, hyper-paranoid, exhausted billionaire, they realize they have engineered the perfect skeleton key. Eleanor, now, Claire, doesn't need to invent a new persona because human nature is highly predictable. The sanctuary trap works flawlessly because the absolute lack of a threat is the one thing a heavily armored target has no defense against. She will repeat this cycle forever, draining empires until the end of time. The 12th and final law of power in the game of seduction. The devil does not need a new disguise if the old one still works. If you are an apex predator heavily guarded against war, your greatest threat will always come disguised as peace. Thank you for watching the conclusion of She Loved Him, Until the Empire Was Hers. Welcome to the Dark Mind Society.